Hi, Sam. You can sit in either. There's no. Oh, here. I have a spare. You can sit in either. Okay, I have 6 o'clock. So welcome to the September 8th meeting of the Comprehensive Rezoning Update Task Force. Carla, is everything good?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay, great. So if you're in the room with us here, we just ask that you please keep your mask on and practice social distancing. And if you're joining us via live stream and you'd like to participate in the meeting, I'm looking for it, Cindy. You can participate by calling in to 1-872-239-8359 and enter the conference ID 488-532-082#. So we'll begin with our roll call. Al Nickerson.
Here.
Bill Norris.
Here.
Bill Sutton.
Here.
Brian Greenwood. I think.
Here.
Yep, thank you. Buck Nickerson. Chicky Shawani. Cindy Ganther.
Cindy's here.
Hi, Cindy. James Saunders. Joe Hickman.
Here.
Pat Langenfelder.
Here.
Paul Ruge.
Here.
Sam Shogi.
Here.
Tom Mason.
Here.
And Tyler Brown. Okay. So for anyone that's joining for the first time, just a few words about what we're doing here. We're trying to engage in fair and open discussion. There's no right or wrong inputs, so everyone is encouraged to share their ideas openly and freely. We ask that you speak through the chair. This means raising your hand if you want to speak and waiting for the chair to call on you. Please don't interrupt others. Don't talk or debate among yourselves. Please respect others' views. Please keep your contributions short and to the point. We have a very lengthy agenda. We will try to start and end on time. And if you're online or on the phone, have your video on mute and your mute on. Wait for me to call your name before you unmute. That way we won't hear a lot of static. Okay. First item, we want to review the minutes. But this is not from the last meeting. These are the minutes from the August 11th meeting. So are there any additions or corrections to the minutes as distributed? Pat?
Yes, I have a question and a comment. I'm trying to find the right, I had it marked and I can't find it, sorry. Yeah, on the last item that we discussed, which was setbacks, I think that was the topic one was the setbacks. I'm looking at page 5. And then there was comments by the task force members, then they have public comment, and it quotes various people who were here in person. But there's nothing here about written comments, and we've received quite a bit of written comment on this particular topic. And I think we need to reference that in our minutes. And going back in previous minutes, that has occurred also, but I just picked it up tonight or today when I was reading it again, and I was looking for that because I think somewhere in an earlier topic, it was mentioned that there were, oh, here it is, on page 4, when it was talking about utility scale energy systems, it mentions that there were correspondence received and what their opinions were. Not specific to who or what, but at least it was incorporated into the summary. So my point is, going forward or even going backward, if we're going to use these summaries as a basis of what we're deciding, I think the public comments that are written comments, they should have the same input as someone who comes here in person, because we give them that option.
Yes, yes.
That's my only comment.
And so Carla or staff, is that an issue that could we just summarize and say, of the comments we received in writing, majority said X or minority said Y?
Just to clarify, this is about setbacks for animal uses?
Yeah, it was on, yes.
Okay. I think part of this issue was we received a lot of correspondence following this meeting that gets referenced in the next set of minutes, but we can certainly go back and say correspondence was received based on, for this particular item, because it was received afterwards, but we can certainly note that.
Okay,
I believe
great.
there were 10 pieces, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe?
Right, Madam Chair, we just want to make sure that we ask everyone to identify themselves so that those people who are watching the live stream know who's speaking.
Joe Hickman. I'm not asking that the minutes be amended on my comments here, but it's a question, it's maybe a stylistic or process question, but on page 8, paragraph 6 and 7, 6 and 7, paragraph 7, I think is a comment I made, which is accurate. Fourth member added anecdotally that he has the opposite experience, was referencing a comment made before that a member citizen considered Kent County too restrictive and they would not move. I feel that was also anecdotally. We don't need to change anything. My question is, anecdotal comments in general, if we're using these minutes, we're gonna have anecdotal comments here all night. We should. It's a back and forth. We're looking for consensus. But I don't think in the minutes, those back and forths don't need to be referenced that way unless they specify specific items, specific people, specific situations. And I think this those things just add nothing to it. My comment didn't either. I mean, it was my opinion. And I just feel like I'd like the minutes to be a little more succinct and accurate on the topics. But I'm not suggesting we amend the minutes for that. I just want to ask in the future if we could look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Any other comments or questions? So Tyler, I am acknowledging, I do see that you've joined us.
Yes, I'm
so
here.
Anyone, Brian or Tyler, any comments or changes to the minutes? Or Cindy?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay, so hearing none, I recommend we accept the minutes as submitted with the addition of Pat's comment that we could put in as a subsequent event the correspondence that was received and identify, whether it was a majority or a minority opinion. Thank you, Sam. So old business, we had a lively discussion last week on around elimination of the 10% rule. Does anyone want to make further comment there? Or a review of the density clock reset in AZD? And the final thing we discussed last week was a request to add agritourism as a permitted use in AZD, but we did not get to the discussion around weddings as special exceptions. So if there's no other old business, I suggest we proceed with the
There's a
discussion.
hand up.
Oh, sorry, Joe.
No problem. I agree. No, I think Mrs. Langfelder mentioned, I'd like to note that in the review of old business, we could add letters that were received based on the topic TF2, TF5, and add those to the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I think we can add those into the minutes for last meeting. Yep. Okay. Now, Mark, was that you who was leading us through the discussion around weddings?
That was me, yes.
Okay, great.
It's, the portion on weddings was the second part of agritourism, because sometimes weddings are considered as agritourism. Currently, our land use ordinance does not outrightly permit weddings within AZB. We've been getting increasing number of inquiries regarding whether or not they could be held in AZB. So we request that to be opened up for consideration to include weddings with AZB. I have brought in some language from nearby counties and the way that they address weddings in their agricultural areas. They include Queen Anne's, Howard, and Talbot counties. Typically, they define them as special events or temporary events. Commonly, they have restrictions upon nuisance, numbers, quantities of guests that may arrive. And those are kind of common through them. Some variations, but that's the common theme. So we recommend that task force consider suggesting the inclusion of weddings as special use and that they carry additional standards to address maximum event size, frequency of events, hours of operation, nuisance control, and public safety.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, I had a question. If the weddings are included as a special use, are they going to have standards that are specific unto themselves, or would those standards match all temporary events, or I forget the term you just used?
Yeah, I think that would be for us to decide. We could propose something specific to weddings, but it might be better to have it as common type of events. It could be receptions, so it could be any sort of type of social gathering. So depending on how we define it, and we could then apply particular standards to that.
Right. That was my concern, that you could have a large party that wasn't a wedding that might have the same issues as a wedding.
Right. Yeah, I think, for example, with Queen Anne's, they talk about social engagements.
Right.
So it could be a business meeting, a conference, or something like that.
Thank you.
I believe there's a question.
Sorry, Pat.
Yeah, my question is, these events would only fall under this category if they're the landowners being paid for the people to go there. Is that correct? Or is it for any party or any wedding? For example, my grandson who was married on our farm, it was a family member. We had a wedding on our farm. We were not compensated. We would have to come in for everyone who has a family wedding on their farm because their kid got married. we all have to come in here and have a special exception and a site
see what
plan
you're
review
saying.
and a traffic review. And
Um,
that's what I'm trying to find. I thought this, if it were work, if the landlord's being compensated is one thing, he's hiring out his farm, then yeah, we can be limiting that because that could happen every weekend. But if it's a family member or whatever, however, or if you're having a large party and you put a tent up because you're not going to use your house, we have to come in here and get a site plan review or something like that. That's my question.
One second. Okay. Yeah, so Carlos pointed out in regards to the examples given, and they didn't read them out in their entirety. For Queen Anne's, they talk about events that are used for compensation. So that same language could be woven within anything we put within our ordinances.
Well, I do know that Eastern Shore Land Conservancy has restrictions, and I think maybe I've been off the mouth for too long to know, but I know the Conservancy, excuse me, does limit the number, but it's always because it's for compensation, not because it's a family party.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Are there any questions or comments from folks on the telephone or? All right. Yeah, I'm gonna call on folks. Al, do you want to go ahead, Sam?
You might have mentioned this earlier about weddings versus social engagement. Just a quick clarification. So what you're proposing is allowing, I guess, what would be considered a social engagement, of which weddings would kind of fall under that classification. Is that what we are essentially kind of proposing here? Social engagement and not just specifically weddings, correct?
Yes, again, it's for us to define, but I think it makes sense to phrase it as social engagements,
Right.
including weddings, business conferences. It could be a variety of things.
So if we had a business that wanted to, say, for instance, host a hot air balloon festival, would that be considered social event, or would that be a separate classification?
I don't know. I'm not sure about aviation restrictions. That might play in.
So specifically, I'm referencing down in Talbot County in Trapp, if I'm not mistaken. There is a winery that hosts a big hot air balloon festival. So I'm just trying to figure out that as a reference. What would we consider that? Would that be a social engagement, or would that fall under something separate? So would there be, like, say, weddings typically host anywhere from 50 to 150 people. So if this social engagement is going to, say, attract 300 or 400 people, should we consider somewhat different standards? So if somebody wanted to host, say, like a music festival where they wanted to bring in hundreds of people, rather than just a wedding, which is, pretty formulaic in how it runs and operates, and you typically don't exceed a certain number of guests. I'm just trying to determine if we should break that out a little bit more, where social engagements covers everything under, say, 200 people, but a large scale event that could potentially attract hundreds of people should be considered something different.
I think of large scale events as being more of a public offering as opposed to a social engagement, or might be more by invitation.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of language can be included, and that would restrict the numbers they know ahead of time. Of course, ticket sales could be a component
Right.
of restricting numbers as well. I think what you may be referring to are more like carnivals or some of the things that we do allow within the county. So this would be a different phrasing, I believe.
Okay.
Again, it's for us to collectively construct and define how
Right.
we would permit.
So non-ticketed social affair or social engagements.
Yeah.
Public, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And Sam, just as Mark alluded to,
in the agricultural zoning district, we do currently have a permitted use, which is circus or carnival, midways, amusement parks, maze fields, and other temporary recreational uses for a specified period as a permitted use, that we make people come get a use permit for. And then we also had an instance where a farm wanted to be able to host concerts throughout sort of like the summer season, and have hundreds, potentially thousands of people. And they got a special exception as an exposition center or fairgrounds, which probably needs a little tweaking if we want to continue to allow sort of those larger ticketed type events. But I think a lot of it sort of comes down to the frequency of which somebody wants to be able to make their property available for lease for these kinds of events. If it's a one-time thing, then it's probably under an AZD, at least it's that temporary recreational use. If it's somebody who wants to have permission from this summer forever to have, 5 or 6 concerts, then we're probably looking at something else, because the farm that wanted to do the concerts had to work with the health department to make sure that they knew what to do about food service. They had to put together an emergency response plan that was part of their site plan and Board of Appeals review to show that they had given consideration on how to get emergency vehicles in and out of the property should the need arise, what kind of staff they would have on site for that kind of thing. So they were looking for big scale events.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that added clarification.
Are there any comments from the public on the phone? Anyone calling in that wants to comment? Or anyone? Oh, Al?
I would just like to know, do we know that if any of those other counties have a noise ordinance?
Yes, they do. They have times restricted operation, usually shutting off by 10 p.m., which I think is common here as well.
And that's what Kent County is as well?
Do they have a noise ordinance though?
I didn't see specific to decibels allowed, just basic nuisance kind of laws, mostly about numbers and screening. So I'm not sure in terms of specific allowance for noise.
I guess my comment would be that would, I think, be one of the personally only negative thing would be
Right.
the neighbors enduring the noise if it carried on into the wee hours of the night.
Right.
So.
There's one aspect, notification of the neighboring properties could be included with a number that could be called if they have concerns. So that could be part of the requirements for hosting such events.
Any other questions or comments, Tom?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that ag tourism is going to become more than what we've seen in the past. And I don't think we want to make restrictions to the point where it's really stops people. And sometimes you don't know how many people you're going to have until maybe right before the event. I think September the 11th, Jim Saunders' son is going to be singing at the Williams Farm. I wouldn't want to try to stop something like that. We don't know. Sometimes noise levels, a noise to one person is not a noise to someone else. I don't imagine there'd be any more noise there than what would be in a Kent County high school football game. If Kent County scored a touchdown and everybody cheered, that's probably more noise than you're going to have at some of these events. So I think we need to be very careful that we don't put restrictions. And then we've got to remember, we're only talking about the ag zoning district, which in most cases, it's not around people. There are some cases. Brian's farm is right outside Wharton, which is fairly close close. If you looked at Crow's Farm, if they had had an event, who's going to hear it? So I do think we need to, allow it and keep any restrictions to a minimum.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Please, Cindy.
So it's for staff. So we're talking about just adding weddings as one special exception in the AZD right now?
This was brought up because under the topic of agritourism, because sometimes it's considered as such, and it is something that comes up more and more frequently in terms of hosting weddings, not in a commercial way. So the idea was to address weddings. It doesn't have to be specifically isolated to that. It could be more of the social kinds of activities, which can vary. But this point was just to include weddings in a discussion, which could be wrapped inside some other greater topic, if I understand your question.
Well, yeah, that was my question, whether it was more than just weddings.
Yeah, and Cindy, I think we were trying to initiate the discussion, and based on the questions that we've been getting most often, are can I host weddings? If I buy this farm, can I host weddings? Has been a question we've probably gotten once a week this summer, and so this was the starting point, because we really might also want to consider including the Resource Conservation District, because I think most of the questions have really come from the waterfront farms, which are obviously very picturesque for hosting weddings. And so we're looking for feedback from the task force as to what you think is appropriate, because we don't really specify these kinds of uses right now.
Thank you, Carla. Sam?
I wonder if it would be worthwhile to consider a cap potentially on how many of these events they can host. And I only say that because I want to be mindful of some of those wedding venues that are already in existence, where that may be their primary source of income. So, I mean, if we open up, say, the majority of the county for weddings, it might start to undercut, some of the businesses. I'm thinking some of our inns and bed and breakfasts where, the owner might have paid top dollar to acquire that property, factoring in weddings as a pretty crucial part of their overall business model. So perhaps considering, I agree with Commissioner Mason. I don't want to add any undue regulations, but I also do want to be mindful of those businesses that are already in existence, where this might be, a major contributing factor to their bottom line. So considering a cap on how many events that they can have.
Sure.
And Sam, do you have a sense as to what kind of cap you think is appropriate?
Yeah, so I think maybe making it the same as some of those larger scale events that we were talking about. If there is already a cap in place for those, okay, so you're shaking your head, so no. I mean, at this point, it might be somewhat arbitrary, but perhaps 6 over the course of a year. That at least gives us a starting point. Maybe some of our neighboring counties that have legislation like this in place already might have some type of cap in place that we could consider.
Carla, I have a question. Don't we have a cap in other districts?
No.
So we don't, even at the marinas and such, we don't have any.
We don't have caps on any kind of event type stuff. And like I said, the one farm that came in for concerts, which never really came to fruition, I'd have to go to the Board of Appeals decision to see what they presented, but it was something that they kind of presented as this is what we want, and the Board of Appeals then agreed to whatever think Pat has a question.
Pat, please.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on what Sam was saying. This is Pat Langefler, sorry. I think you, in what I'm reading in this presentation was that the other counties that were being used as for us to look at, it mentions having maximum numbers. So maybe we should see what their maximum numbers are. And I know the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy definitely has a max, but I don't, off the top of my head, do not remember. But that was on their, land that they have easement on. So, and a lot of those are on waterfront, and therefore they're, they're very popular too to be a venue. So, but they do place a cap, and I think there is even a cap on the number of attendees.
Right. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pat. Tom?
So would these caps be on not only in the ag zone, but also the bed and breakfasts? And well, I don't see how that's fair, because some of these people buying these properties are probably spending more money than a bed and breakfast is. So and let free enterprise govern it. If the person wants to go to a farm to have their wedding, okay. If they want to go, say, to some, I don't know where, that's already, well, I guess you could say at Great Oak Manor, that's fine, but let free enterprise decide that, because I don't see how it's fair to limit that on an agricultural zone and not limit it in other zones. The people are going to decide where they want to go. And I don't think we should be, okay, you can't have any more weddings here, but you can go over here to this place. That's like giving preference to certain businesses. And I mean, I understand what you're saying, the ones are already there, but maybe they'll have to innovate and do something a little different. I mean, I just don't think we should, we have to do the same for everybody.
So, can I respond?
Please.
So I would normally be inclined to agree, but I think this is already a pretty healthy compromise, because what's currently in place is they can't have any. And the direction that we're moving towards is that you can, there just is some type of ceiling. And I don't know, I feel as if it can always be reevaluated in the future if there is all of a sudden an explosion of demand, especially at the same particular property. But we're already moving in the right direction by kind of opening it up. But we also want to be mindful of whoever the neighbors are that we're currently opening up to, and our current businesses who have been paying property taxes and their accommodations tax as an inn and bed and breakfast. So I think we're saying the same thing. We're still moving in the right direction. I think we just want to look at farther. Nothing wrong with
nothing wrong with what you're saying. I guess I want to move a little faster rather than a little slower.
Any other comments or questions? Janet?
Janet Richardson, Rezoning. I was having difficulty understanding what you said. Oh, is this on? Can you hear me?
You're a little low, so you might want to project. Yep.
Is that it? Is
Yes.
that better?
Yes.
Okay. Were you saying that the neighbors would have to be notified of this happening, or I missed that part, or did you say they just have to have a number? I didn't get that part.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So is in response to the question about noise,
Right.
and that as a nuisance, and how that might be set or regulated. So in some type of events, they do provide notification to neighbors and notification of a number to call in case they do have complaints of noise. So it's just an option, not something that I'm necessarily recommending, just presenting it as an ideal that could be put within the provisions.
Okay, so it could be part of the ordinance that we would require notification of the neighbors. And let's say the neighbors had a problem with it. Could they come in to talk about why they shouldn't get the permit to have it on that particular day, or would they just be ignored? I mean, if they had some, let's say they had some conflicting thing that they had already planned on their property on that particular date, and this noise was they were having a yoga retreat. Would they have some leverage to, or would it just be, well, too bad, you just have to cope?
That's a good question. I mean, it would be a permitted use. Could have it so they would need a permit to have these operate, and you could restrict the numbers by the number of permits issued to a particular property. So if there were complaints against that particular property, conceivably they could just be denied a permit because of complaints in the past.
Okay, so that could be a direction that the task force might consider. I don't even know if would you have to make it a permitted use and deny the permit? Or if somebody had a number of complaints, could you then not allow them the special use?
I'm not sure of the history here in Kent County in terms of how that may have been addressed before. I don't know if my colleagues have comments or historical perspective on that.
Oh, Jamie, do you have a response to that? I think you'll have to come to the microphone, sorry.
And again, I just want to remind everyone to say your name before you speak so that people know who's speaking.
So Jamie Williams, I'm Director of Economic and Tourism Development. And these weddings are taking place on these properties already. It's not been an issue in the past. I do feel that having it in the ordinance as a permitted use or a special exception is a great idea. I think the staff recommendation of trying to determine what the standard should be, the maximum size, all of that, I'm in favor of all of that. I don't think we need to make it wide open, but I will say that, again, I've been with the county now for 10 years. It's very prevalent, and we've not run into any conflicts with neighbors or issues.
Thank you very much. Carla, do you want to add anything there?
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, good. All right.
I wanted to add something,
Oh,
if
Cindy.
I can. Yeah, I think what we're just talking about is globally, starting with the idea of a wedding, but then globally, do we want to provide in the ordinance for other events, special events? So we could have weddings, and we could have special events. You could have weddings as a permitted use in one zone and special exception in another zone. And then other factors that weigh in would be whether in some zones it's appropriate to have restrictions on, number of events or people or number of people who can attend the events. But then to add in restrictions about noise, that really wouldn't be something I think the task force would want to consider, because we would need a noise ordinance in the county to enforce that. So like Carla said, when I asked my specific question about weddings, it sounds like we're just opening this up as a general conversation and really I think what the task force would need to see would be a draft ordinance ultimately to be able to make a recommendation, and that could be somewhat complex, really, I guess, with what
just a question, Cindy. So at the Planning Commission, we actually did talk about decibels as it relates to weddings or events. So I'm just curious, like we did it there, why couldn't we do it here?
Well, I'm not saying you couldn't put those restrictions in. We certainly couldn't talk about any specific application that the Planning Commission has considered. But those would be the kinds of conditions that for example, if we're talking about a special exception use, a wedding is a special exception use in a particular zoning district, then the Board of Appeals could set standards as part of its authority in granting that request with respect to noise. But I think the issue that we've run into before is that without a noise ordinance, it's hard to enforce any sort of decibel standard.
That's true. We do have a very long agenda, so unless someone has something new to add to the discussion.
One more question. Final question. Is the intention to make this a special exception or a permitted use?
I think in terms of addressing any constraints, a special exception would be the better approach.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and Janet?
The state stopped enforcement of noise ordinances in 2004 when they lost funding. They do have a COMAR for a minimum, for what they consider a basic level of noise in the state. But other counties have come forward to put in noise ordinances, and it's very specific. And if you're on a farm that's out in the middle of nowhere, you probably won't get really noise ordinances only have to be enforced if somebody complains, and they need to have a level to complain at. If you're out somewhere and you're not bothering anybody, you're not going to get any complaints. Therefore, you can be as loud as you want, even above the noise ordinance. I mean, you're not going to have a police coming by and saying, I heard your thing, it was above. But the noise ordinance has to be, you would have to make sure that it's at a level that doesn't interfere with somebody's right to use their own property, so that if they complained about it, they could get a response, and they would be within their legal limits to say, this noise is exceeding the decibels. And, you know, as Tom has pointed out, if you're a farm in the middle of nowhere, you can exceed the decibels to your heart's content. But if you're next door to a family property, you can't. I think that really needs to be considered in this particular ordinance when we're talking about having these events. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I think we should.
Tim, just the problem, I think, this is Tom, the problem there is who's measuring the decibels and who's going to enforce it. We don't have anyone in King County that's going to enforce it, and we don't have anyone Carla's not going out there, Mike's not going out there. Okay, you're over. So I don't see how that's a viable concern.
Thank you, Tom. So it seems like we're in favor of including weddings as a special exception with standards. You've got a lot of feedback to take into consideration. So let's move on to new business. And we have Jamie Williams, who's going to give us a summary of the 2020 census data and tools.
So some of the 2020 census data has started to come out. So as we're going through this plan, I thought it was very important that we share that and let you guys know where we stand. First thing I want to say, I've been telling a lie for a while because that's what I heard when I came to the county. And I recently found a document from 1970 that has some census data in it. And now I realize it was a lie, so I'll stop telling it. But I had heard that our population has been stagnant for hundreds of years. Well, that's just not true. Our population has been increasing slowly over time. But what I will share is that in The 2000 census, Kent County's number was 19,197, and I can share any of these documents or all of these documents with everyone. And in 2010, there was 20,197. In the 2020 census, we actually decreased population by 999. So we are now at 19,198, which is a decrease of 4.9%. They did release the census data by jurisdiction, by county, and they also released the census data by towns as well. I think it's important to note that the town of Chestertown increased by 280 residents, and the loss were in the other towns and in the county. So I wanted to share that information. One of the things we were really interested in was the age data and where we lost that population. Not a lot has been released on the age data. They're expected to release additional information in September and December. But what we do know at this point is it is broken out by age 18 and over and under the age of 18, and it's about 50-50. We lost 485 age 18 and over, and under the age of 18, 514. The next point of data that's relevant is housing units by jurisdiction. So for Kent County, we lost 263 housing units, a decrease of 2.5%. Again, they did release that data by municipalities as well. And again, the town of Chestertown added 93 household units. So the loss was in the other municipalities and the county. Another interesting statistic, and I don't think this one is a surprise to anyone, but the average household size in 2010 was 2.29. It has decreased to 2.21. I think we've all seen a trend of people having less children, or some people opting not to have children at all. So that's a pretty interesting statistic. There is other statistics as far as race and group quarters, meaning like your detention center and your nursing homes, but I don't really think that's as relevant to this group. However, if anyone wants that data, again, I have it and can share it with anyone. So I wanted to share the census data. And then I have a little more data that I want to share during the conversation that goes back to the Economic Development Strategic Plan from 2017. There was a line in there that said agriculture accounted for 91.2% of land use and 13.6% of real property taxable assessable base in 2016. So I did not want to repeat that until I verified the numbers for 2021. So for 2021, agriculture accounted for 90% of land use and 14% of the real property taxable assessable base in 2021. So the property tax revenue that comes to the county from agriculture is 14% for property taxes. There's other factors to consider. And I also wanted to note that in the county, excluding the municipalities, 89% of the land is zoned agriculture. So I got a lot of data here, a lot of numbers, willing to share that again with anyone or everyone, and so that we actually know what we're looking at as we're going through and updating the zoning ordinance and how we want to move Kent County forward.
Thank you, Jamie. Is it combined in a report that you can send to us, or?
I wish. I really had to do a lot of digging, but I did pull a lot of the PDFs Madam Chair, and I can certainly send you all of those along with the links of where I found them. Especially on the land use and accessible tax base, I included all of the links to where I found the information so that we know how to go back and get it to compare going forward.
Great. Yeah, I think it would be useful, at least for the task force, since we do speak in terms of anecdotes a lot. I think having some facts.
Absolutely.
One thing that I always heard, like I came here in '78, and I think I heard it back then, is that we're the same population we were during the Civil War. So is that like a myth, or do we know?
So, okay, so I'm really bad with dates. Date of the Civil War?
1868.
Thank you. 1861. That is not true. 13,267.
So we've grown, thank God.
Yes, yeah. And I had heard the same thing. I don't know where I heard it, but I was repeating it. So, like I said, now that I know better, I'll stop lying.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jamie Jo? Yeah, we should use the microphone so everyone can hear. Sorry.
Joe Hickman. Jamie, at some point in one of our planning meetings, they talked about Washington College. And we were told then that they were included in the census. Those, when they're residents here, they're included. So I guess my question, the college, I think announced they have 1,200 students. Were they, 2020 census, they weren't here as far as I know in general?
Yes. The 2020 census, wherever they were residing as of April 1st, that's where they counted. So that's part of the group quarters data. So yes, they are included.
But
Does that help?
if they weren't here in 2020 when the census, if they weren't here when it was taken.
Carla, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Are you saying because of COVID?
Right. What they
Question?
tried to do was to put them back where they would have been. So the Census Bureau tried to take that into account. So that if students would have been on campus April 1st, 2020, they got counted here in Chestertown as opposed to wherever they might have been because of COVID.
Okay, I know this has been a debate around the country about this, not just for colleges, but because of COVID, of the acting and the validation of the census. And I heard it differently, but I'm not. That's what I heard, and that. But I wondered if that's not the 1,000 people that.
And I can tell you that in the spring of 2020, while the census was gearing up and was going on, that's what they were telling us, is that they would go back and sort of cross-match where students, if they got counted at their home residence, they were going to try to figure out how to put that back to where they would fit in school.
Okay, that's great. Can we find that out?
I have it here, Joe.
Okay.
I didn't
Thank you.
look into the group quarters as much, but it is right here. So for the group quarters for college and university students, we went from 1,133 to 974, but also take into account that Washington College population used to be 1,500 students, and now they're like between 12 and 1,300. So we only lost 159 there.
Okay.
So,
And
does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Jamie and Joe, this is Carla again. I will add that based on my experience with the census data, this first cut of data is what they call for the redistricting data and is not going to be the final set of numbers that will come out. It'll shift a little bit. Like I think they've already accounted for putting the prison population back in the home county, and we're now at like 19,239. Just with that little bit of a shift that happened with data they released, I think, late last week. So census data really is kind of a moving target. It's very hard to give you, say, this is exactly what the number is, because they will make adjustments as they release different data products.
Yeah, I agree completely, Tara and Jamie. It also, because we're only 20,000 people, those hundreds make a big difference when you do percentages. It's not,
Exactly.
and I'm not saying the standard, we're not growing. We know we can see that maybe. And I have another question if I can ask one here. You brought up the accessible tax base for ag land, and I guess do you have it for other districts? Why did we just do ag land? I guess that's my question.
Yes, we do. We do have other districts. And the reason I didn't only do ag land, I did ag, commercial, and residential. So the reason that I did that, it kind of goes back to the history of when I started with the county. I heard that our top 3 industries were agriculture, maritime, and tourism. And I never heard anything about healthcare, education, or manufacturing, which were our top 3 major employers. So it made me dig into the data to try to figure out what really drives the economy. And if you're measuring by jobs, wages, or gross regional product, agriculture does not drive the economy. It's very important to our culture, to our history, to our tourism. So there's a balance, but we've got to be talking about all of it, not just segregating one and protecting one at the expense of the whole. That's why.
Okay, well, I think statistics, you know, they talk about statistics make liars, but in some respects, and you know I'm going to disagree, but it's about agricultural. I just don't think it gets the gross dollars are completely different than Waterman at this point. Completely different. When you have that many acres in product, gross sales, things like employment, certainly different. But we just had, we did the planning commission last week. We added 40% more jobs at John Deere, and we're lost out of Cecil. Retail jobs is the way they were categorized.
Mm-hmm.
Those are not retail jobs; they're ag jobs.
And I agree. And when we look,
I think that those same thing. You can't. I guess my concern is you're saying the assessed value takes up so much, but you don't talk about the services that are required to support that versus
no, absolutely, absolutely, we do. No.
Well, I guess
you haven't heard all the conversations, or you haven't read the complete plan, because we definitely talk about those other industries. Every industry has a direct impact and output, an indirect input and impact and output, and induced. So it's not just agriculture. If you look at education, education has the same components of direct, indirect, and induced. So you've got to look at all of those things and look at your economy and analyze the data. And it's not as easy as one would think. Well, can't you just get that data off of the internet, just like Chair Cole had asked, is there a place where you can actually find this as a packet of data? It's not. You've really got to go and look for it and put it all together and know what your community is. And then you put all that together, and then from there is where you kind of decide, okay, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, and how are we going to get there?
Okay. Well, the only reason I brought it up at all is because we only heard about ag. That's what you mentioned, ag's land use and assessed value, not the others. That's why I brought it up.
Because there was a quote in the Economic Development Strategic Plan from 2017, and I've heard a couple of people repeat that, and I didn't want that repeated if it was old data. So I wanted to have fresh data and up-to-date data.
Well, I think sharing the data that you do have would be a great, bring us all up to speed. We can all stop lying. Right. Joe, do you have another question?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Jamie.
I just want to see if there's anyone who's dialed in. Any questions or comments? Well, thank you very much.
Tim, I had a question for James. In your professional opinion, where does this leave Kent County then? Are we progressing, degressing, staying the same economically? And I'm looking at income that the county's going to have to pay for schools, pay for roads, pay for all the things that
I don't think we're moving forward. We're moving forward slowly, but is that due to inflation, or is that due to just, the assessments of our properties going up as they have over the last couple of years when it comes to revenue coming to the county? I do see a lot of new businesses starting, but then I see other businesses going, leaving for different reasons. But I feel like Kent County is now on the map. I feel like we can move forward. I just feel like we have to get the right strategies in place and decide as a group what we want. And I do have some additional comments that I had from last week. Obviously the meeting went long and I did not get to, so I don't know if now's the time to share that or if I should wait. But I think ag preservation and economic development can coexist. It doesn't have to be at such, butting heads every time. We can really work together and move Kent County forward. We just need to have open, respectful conversations.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I suggest we take a break. It's after 7. So let's take a 10-minute break. That clock is wrong. So 7 o'clock, let's adjourn and we'll join at 7:10. So if you're on the phone, we're going to take a break and come back at 7:10. Remember, the microphones are on, so you may want to have private conversations elsewhere.
Well, that's not worth it. Social distance, but I can't even tell the social distance, right? So I think I may have. Well, I've got 2 shots. I think in some cases, this is Bill's youngest. Yeah. Go back to school today. She says, yes, it's last first day. Yes, it's. Perhaps we can bring this. I would love to see that. It's too bad. My son's coming up this morning. The Census website. They have. It's very mostly. So just like somehow it's just but be careful. Once you start
I'm counting down the legs. Can't wait. Even though it comes up to 6 degrees, it feels like that's just how, I put my head down and do some work and I'll do oh, well. Yeah, money. I'll do it for money. That's right. Yeah. I don't know. You get the school days before. Yeah. It's, and just looking around locally, what we need is an infusion. We need an infusion of kids. You see, that's what's happening. There's no relationship. That's right. You don't get any new families. When I graduated from Kent County High School, we had 100 kids. Yeah, 15, maybe. Somebody in the Kent County. So we change some of this stuff. Untitled Chapter. Next time. Whatever you download, it's free. What was the last major subdivision? What's keeping I mean, so let's take Coventry, for instance. The land right next to Coventry too was supposed to be Coventry free. We're talking to that developer. Why didn't they? Where was that? Yeah. So back up there in the woods. Yeah, yeah. So, what prevented that developer from finishing Coventry 3? Right. So
We might. We might. Huh? No way? It depends on how much they want to talk about the other things. They're a lot easier. No, well, no, I knew weddings would be. Yeah. No. Mm-mm.
Oh, yeah, you got a lot of work.
That's right. That's right. Well, we deserve our farmers. We got to take back things.
Yeah, I wish there was a way to systematically hold those bigger home builders, you know, one at a time, two at a time. It's like, what are the pieces of reasons, you know? That's a big thing right there. Right. That's the bottom line. That's right. You gotta have more. Yeah.
No, we've heard at least the last 4 or 5 years. Too many people. Right. And we have heard that we're gonna have too many people. It's not happening.
Okay. I'm putting the microphone back on, so let's move forward. Next up, we're going to discuss considering removing the renewal requirements for sand and gravel pits. Is that you, Carla?
That is me, yes.
Okay.
This one should be pretty quick. So there was a court case in 2012, East Star LLC versus County Commissioners of Queen Anne's County that, and the summary was in the staff report, but basically said that state law preempted a lot of what counties could do. Queen Anne's County had adopted regulations very similar to our special exception for sand and gravel pits, and so we're just proposing that we make some changes to the standards for sand and gravel pits for the special exception to make sure that we are in compliance with the decision in that court case. So I am on page 2 of that memo that had some yellow highlighting on the current standards for sand and gravel pits, and those are the ones that we are recommending be removed. The most significant one I would say is that the special exceptions for gravel pit won't require a renewal every 5 years. So unless the operator of the gravel pit wants to make some significant change to their operation, the Board of Appeals would only review it the first time. The Planning Commission would review the site plan once, and then they would just be allowed to operate.
Okay, let's open it for discussion. Anyone have any questions or comments? Pat?
Yeah, my question is regarding the letter A under number 52. Does the state require them to renew? I mean,
State licenses, mining licenses do have to be regularly renewed.
okay, so that's why we can eliminate this because someone else is actually overseeing it.
So
Okay.
gravel pits operate under a state mining license that has many of these same requirements, and we're trying to take out the ones that are duplicative.
Okay, thanks.
Joe Hickman?
Yes, Joe Hickman. Carla, the same question on A. Part of the reason for this is once again to allow the public to have an ability to comment on a permit that was permitted, and then hopefully the conditions of that permit are being fulfilled. And I think that's a reasonable thing. We haven't had much trouble with it, but up at Kent Sand and Gravel, we changed conditions, and that for the neighbors, particularly the town of Massey, and I guess my question is, we cannot have stronger restrictions, or we're just trying to avoid a lawsuit?
I believe that this would be considered a case where we cannot be more restrictive than state law. And I will say that our notification sort of about this case came from the owners of Kent Sand and Gravel, who asked that their special exception conditions be revised to be in compliance with what was in this decision.
Okay, thank you. And Cindy, could I ask the question you were looking at? I guess that was my question, is more the reason we're doing it,
Right.
if it's for the law or the state law. So I guess, is that?
Right, as a result of this case, we're not the only jurisdiction changing those regulations, those restrictions. It's sand and gravel pits are regulated by the Department of the Environment, and so the county can't impose more restrictive conditions.
And they have the hours of operation,
in
those use.
particular areas.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Anyone online or on the phone that wishes to comment? That one was straightforward, Carla. Oh, Janet?
Janet Christensen, Lewis. When in our zoning ordinance, we reflect state law in several different areas, including one of them would be the Forest Conservation Act. We do that. We can make it more restrictive. In this case, it looks like the court has ruled that we can't be more restrictive than what the state does. But why wouldn't we continue to reflect in our zoning ordinance the state rules as we do? I think forest conservation is the only thing that we translate into our zoning ordinance. Why are we making an exception in this rule, I guess is mine with this. Was that clear? No.
Yeah. It's my understanding that there are certain state laws that have been determined can't be preempted by or county regulations, and then there are some state laws that do specifically say counties can be more restrictive. So it's kind of how the law is drafted and adopted, and I see Cindy shaking her head, so I don't know if she wants to add anything.
So, right, in the area of forest conservation, the local jurisdictions can have more restrictive requirements, but in this area, sand and mining, sand and gravel pit mining, the state law prevails.
Correct. I understand that, and we wouldn't be able to change that. But why wouldn't we adopt the state law? For one thing, it gives people that are reading the code certainty, right? I mean, they can find it here as opposed to trying to find it on the state website.
Well, Janet, just to call, when you're saying adopt, you just mean cite?
Yeah, to have to cite the exact regulations that the state has in our zoning code.
Yeah.
We would not want to do that because state law can change and then we'd have to change our zoning. So, but we do have that. We can still require a special exception for the initial establishment of a new sand and gravel pit. And one of those things that is required is that the operation is under an approved operating and restoration plan from the state of Maryland. So we're leaving that in place, which says, okay, in order to get your local approval, you have to have your state approval. And we're just sort of altering the law to take out the couple of things that have been sort of expressly outlined in that case as being preempted by state law.
Okay. If they were out of compliance with the state, would the state notify Kent County that they were out of compliance?
You mean if MDE does an inspection of a gravel pit, will they let somebody know if they're out of compliance with the state license?
Yes.
I'm going to say that it would depend on what is out of compliance. For example, we did have an existing gravel pit who recently had their MDE inspection. MDE said, hey, your sediment erosion control plan has expired. You need to have that brought up to date. And we weren't actually notified, but the landowner came to us and said, okay, what do I have to do? And we are in the process of working with them, with soil conservation, to get their sediment erosion control plan re-stamped and brought up to date.
So the county is kind of out of the loop on this.
Pretty much.
So having something in the ordinance that would keep you semi in the loop would not be a good idea?
We can't require renewal.
Okay.
So at this point, it then becomes complaint driven. So if a neighbor says, hey, calls up and says, you know, this sand and gravel pit is operating outside of the hours that are approved, or is destroying our public road that runs by our house, then we might have recourse to go in and do an inspection, but it's going to be limited to sort of the things that we are authorized to regulate through planning and zoning authority.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Carla. We're going to move on to review of S7. This is the definition of structures, especially considering fences. And I see Bill walking forward. Are you going to
Yes, ma'am.
kick us off, please?
Thank you. Bill Mackey. The issue before you tonight in this item is the definition of a structure considering fences. The matter revolves around the fact that the Critical Area Commission does allow certain kinds of fences within the 100-foot buffer. And due to wording in Kent County's definition of structure in the land use ordinance, fences have not been allowed in the 100-foot buffer by Kent County. I think there was a desire to have us be not more restrictive than the state. Staff suggested raising this issue potentially by bifurcating fences into two different categories. Although fences are included in the definition of structure, Kent County doesn't require a permit for a fence. The term fence is also an undefined term in the land use ordinance, which means there's some flexibility. So the definition of structure is before you. That is anything constructed or erected, the use of which requires a more or less permanent location on the ground or attached to something having a permanent location on the ground, including but not limited to mobile homes, signs, swimming pools, fences, gas and liquid storage tanks, backstop for tennis courts, sheds, barns, and pergolas. So a permanent location on the ground would imply a foundation. So fencing, including the fencing in the 100-foot buffer, could be divided into two types, theoretically. A fence requiring a foundation, which might require a buffer variance, and fences without footers or foundations that could meet the limitations of the critical area program and not require a buffer variance. That program sets out some requirements that a fence or wall that is less than a foot in width and has not been constructed with a footer doesn't count as lot coverage. And for the state law, that's what allows, for example, a rail fence where the fence posts are driven to the ground and there's no footer or foundation. So as a potential solution, staff is recommending that the task force consider adding language to the definition section in order to make it completely clear that non-structural fences may be constructed within the 100-foot buffer by altering the definition by adding fences with footers or a foundation to be considered a structure, which would of course leave fences without a footer or foundation not considered to be a structure and therefore would be permitted in that 100-foot buffer. That's the item for you. It seems like a very small detail, but for folks who are on the coast that would like to put up a fence, it's a big deal.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Questions or comments from the task force? Thank you, Sam. Pat?
I agree with the recommendation of staff.
Questions or comments from folks on the phone or online? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I swore we wouldn't make it through the agenda. Maybe we will. Okay, Bill, are you going to take us through accessory structure and accessory use?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
The issue here is that accessory structures have at some times in the past been required to be smaller in area and smaller than height than a primary structure in order to be permitted. And at other times this has not been the case, based on DHC policy. And that means over time, staff brings this item forward so that we no longer will continue interpreting the matter, but set it out in the land use code clearly and permanently. The staff suggestion would alter the language to make it clear, potentially, that an accessory structure or accessory use must be subordinate and incidental, but need not be physically smaller in area. Examples of where this might come across in everyday life would be for commercial buildings. Oftentimes the parking lot is much larger than the building, but certainly not the primary use. In the area of single-family homes, a detached garage might be larger than the house, but it would still be clearly subordinate to the house. Presented before you are the two definitions of accessory structure and accessory use. I'm not going to read through them. There's also a sampling of those definitions from Cecil County and Queen Anne's County, and it would appear that our definition is almost identical to Cecil County, but we have added some terms from the Queen Anne's definition. So there's this sort of hybrid situation. And again, staff is not aware of sort of the origin of these definitions. Who came first? Is ours the model, and others used it and deleted things, or did we rely on others? So, but there's clearly, we have a sort of a pool of definitions, or a semantic field with our neighbors that you can sort of see the family relationships for sure. From a review of the above, it's clear that our definitions are in keeping with our neighboring jurisdictions, and we're proposing two possible recommendations for the task force. One would be to, if the task force would like to see and is comfortable with the position that accessory structures and uses may sometimes be larger in area and height than a principal structure or use, as long as they're clearly subordinate, then deleting certain language from the two definitions would make that clear in the text. On the other hand, if the task force is comfortable with that idea but would prefer that the footprint and the height of a principal structure would always be larger than any accessory structure, we're not going to say accessory use because that probably wouldn't work out, but for accessory structure, if we want to go with that interpretation that a principal use has to be larger in both height and area than a accessory structure, then we would add language to that definition with a little movement to say that it would also have to be smaller in area and lower than height than a principal structure on the site. So it's really sort of, I wanted to give two options to see which way the task force would like to go.
And are we to assume that your recommendation, you're completely neutral?
I think I'm trying to stay neutral. I think functionally, it's difficult to have a definition that changes over time. So either way, there'll be clarity, and the public will know what to expect.
Okay, so we have two options before us. Questions, comments from the task force? Sam?
So I'm inclined to go with the first definition. I don't want to assign a specific footprint to what we deem subordinate or accessory structures, rather, excuse me. So for instance, if you were to buy a small house, but wanted to build a detached garage that is also a workshop, it could easily be bigger than your house, but you still have the added flexibility of having that garage and that additional workspace. So I think having it broken out into accessory structure and accessory use is really good. And I certainly don't want to constrain, a property owner's ability to use their land in a flexible manner. So having these two, both accessory structure and accessory use, the first way that you had in, option A is well written. I certainly don't want to see accessory structure, be smaller than the primary structure. I think that just has too many constraints.
Joe Hickman?
Yeah, Joe quickly. Sam, I don't disagree. I think that the only problem I have with this is for all the definitions for all zoning districts, Bill.
Yes, sir.
Because we brought up the village zone, accessory, structures there, and my sense is there are village areas that you don't want large buildings next to you because they ruin your neighbor's the neighbor's ability to view a neighborhood if you're in a neighborhood. Whereas you have the rural residential lots of 2 acres out there. They're used for a different purpose a lot of times, and that's why some people find them attractive. That's my concern here is that we do have a lot of self-employed people here, and they run their business is not run out of their home, but they have equipment that's allowed with their business, and they bring it home and they do it. If we don't have some size restrictions in some neighborhoods or some zoning districts, I can see the people in a Butler town or even Crestview has some restrictions anyway, but areas that may have small neighborhoods may have some issues with that, and it would impact that. Whereas a rural residential lot, I don't see as a big difference. That's my concern will be, can this be uniform through all zoning districts and appreciate what a village district should look like?
Thank you, Joe. Other questions or comments? Tom?
This is Tom. In the village zoning law, aren't you looking at quarter-acre lots, which once you build a house, you can't build a whole lot more. There's just not enough land there to do it. So, well, there may be other, but I mean, if you had a 2-acre lot somewhere, and I don't know what zoning that would be.
You can have 2-acre lots in village. I mean.
Well, if you bought.
I would say any of our zoning districts have probably a range of areas that have half-acre, quarter-acre lots.
Right.
Up to 10 or 20. I mean,
But
even in some of those village areas.
Yeah, well, you could, but it's going to get a whole lot more expensive to do that to go somewhere else, I would think. I mean, you start trying to take out certain zoning districts and you're defeating the purpose, I think. I mean, a quarter-acre lot, you're not getting an accessory building.
I'll use Chesapeake Landing as an example. If you've been through it, there's a lot of small residential houses there, and a lot of people have buildings there. Some of them are large. But if you allow all of the buildings to be larger than those residences, you'll ruin the character of that neighborhood and thus those people's values, the neighborhood could value. If you got a large building next to you that's not compatible with the neighborhood, that's what neighborhoods, what they're for. I mean, that's why we zone things differently for those uses. So, in a village, if that's a bad example, I'm sorry. But my point was, it looks different in different zoning districts. That's my point. You get out on, Cooper's Lane, those 4 lots off of your farm. Big building out there is compatible, probably. Doesn't matter, that's different.
I don't know. Those lots aren't very big, so once you build your house, how you build your
2-acre lots, but.
This is
2-acre
Carla
lots.
again. I'm going to interject and say that in actually, I think every district but the village district, we do have a size limit over which you have to get a special exception so that we can look at the effect that these larger buildings have on the neighbors and whether additional screening is appropriate or architectural details. So we're not proposing that we say, okay, all districts, any size building you want. We're just saying, do we have to be specific as to, okay, you have an 800 square foot footprint for your house, so your garage can only be 799 square feet. As opposed to, well, your garage is located in your backyard and you've got some trees between it and your house, and anybody driving along the road is still going to see your house as the principal use. That's kind of the discussion that staff has had on how to view these accessory uses.
Thank you, Carl. And I agree that I think if we can take care of it in the zoning regulations of each district, then that would solve that problem. Thank you.
Yep, it's a good point, Joe. Thank you.
Quick question.
This is Sam. So, when it comes to lot coverage, is that only applied in the in critical area, or is lot coverage kind of factored into all zoning districts?
Lot cover, this is Carla, and lot coverage can be factored into all zoning districts from a stormwater management perspective. So critical area has very specific lot coverage limits, that if you want to go over the limit, you have to get a variance. If you want to go over the limit that is permitted under the approval for your lot size and stormwater management, then that's a matter of getting a formal stormwater management plan. So
that's also kind of a built-in
it can be, yes.
mechanism to control the sizable growth that some of these buildings and scale.
Yeah, and for example, that is something we also deal with. There are a number of lots that have been created over the year where the plat says, you know, the lot is limited to 5,000 square feet of disturbance, and therefore it was exempt from doing certain stormwater management. And if they want to go over that amount of disturbance because they've built the house and the driveway, then they have to come get the formal plan.
Any comments or questions from anyone on the phone or online? Okay, so hearing none, it seems, Carla, there's general consensus. Oh, Janet?
This is Janet Christensen Lewis. Carla, it seems that you're saying that we're going to we would be moving to a definition that would cover all zoning districts, but all zoning districts would still not be created equally under this. Because they would have other restrictions that would prevent certain size buildings from being put in place. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what you're hearing.
Thank you.
Okay. So S12, reviewing side setbacks and rear setbacks of 3 and 5 feet respectively for accessory structures in rear yards. Is that Mark?
That is me, yes.
Okay.
So first I just want to make sure that I'm clearly heard. There's some comments I received that was not so audible before, so if I could get some confirmation.
In the back, can you hear Mark? Project.
Okay. Yes, so there was a suggestion that the rear and side yard setbacks, the side setbacks and rear setbacks currently set at 3 and 5 feet for accessory structures in rear yards throughout the land use ordinance be addressed. Currently, Kent County land use ordinance is set within most residential districts a standardized minimum rear yard setback for accessory residential structures at 3 feet from the side and 5 from the rear. The suggestion has been to consider reviewing the side setbacks and rear setbacks of 3 and 5 feet, respectively, for accessory structure in rear yards, which occur throughout the LUO. The purpose of setback requirements in general, both to principal buildings and accessory structures, is to ensure adequate access to the perimeter of a property, improve visual appeal, maintain uniformity, provide for ventilation and light, ensure privacy, eliminate encroachment, provide fire protection, protect public health, and increase safety. Increasingly, county zoning enforcement officers report that they are finding debris, lean-tos, cordwood, and other items stacked against accessory structures and encroaching within setback space, creating unsightly views for adjacent properties and creating habitat for vermin. For comparative purposes, I've looked at some adjacent counties and how they address this particular situation. In Cecil County, they do have some space limitation, no more than 30% of the yard area, and they set the minimum setback 10 feet to rear lot line and 10 feet from a side lot line. Queen Anne's County requires only 3 foot setback from either property, either boundary line. They do have limitations on the size of the structure. Within Talbot County, their setback is 10 feet from the side and 25 feet from the rear lot lines. They can reduce this by half if their structure is within a limited size as well. Our Kent County comprehensive plan in towns and villages chapters encourages a policy framework that guides towns and village growth so it maintains and enhances existing character, keeping towns and villages desirable places to live, so they'll continue to attract residents who might otherwise reside in the countryside. Staff recommends that rear yard setbacks for residential accessory structures be uniformly set at 10 feet for the side and 10 feet for the rear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Comments or questions from the task force? Pat.
Just for clarification purposes, by making this recommendation at 10 feet from side and rear, if someone has already built and it's not, doesn't comply with this, that's just going to be grandfathered, that building or structure is grandfathered in, I assume?
Yes.
Okay.
Just quickly, support staff recommendations and anything to make enforcement easier. It's a tough job in the county. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Comments or questions from folks on the phone?
This is Cindy Genther. I have a question. Why 10 feet? I think that seems excessive.
10 feet was what was recommended by our enforcement officer. So it's a language that we had proposed.
Thank you, Mark. And the enforcement officer is looking at some of the issues that we've had, right, with encroachment or
yes,
vermin or other things that are, yeah.
Yeah.
Tom?
I mean, I kind of agree with the 10 feet, but that's not going to stop someone from putting their wood pile the whole 10 feet now, or, I mean, it's not going to change anything that we have now. And I'm assuming this also includes other barriers like a fence or trees. I mean, you know, everybody will put their fence right on the property line, but this would stop. They would not be allowed to do that either.
No, this would not apply to fences.
Well, why shouldn't it also? That's an accessory structure.
Yes and no. I'm gonna let.
I think fences are treated just as a separate animal. I mean, typically fences are property fences. They run along property lines. Sometimes folks will set them in a few inches for maintenance or something like that. But generally, fences would not be subject to this kind of provision. We wouldn't plan on applying them.
Yeah, and I certainly understand that. And but all of a sudden, what happens there? There's a fence right on the line, and then they're mowing on the other side of the line and taking the neighbor's property. I mean, I understand the fact that you want the fence on the property line because this is your property, but it kind of, like, there's lots of cases where, I mean, that's really, you know, it's abused. And also the trees, they'll plant a tree on the property line, and then in a few years, 20 feet of it's on the neighbor. So, and some of this gets into, you know, houses in the rural area, and also houses in residential areas also. there's probably been many a fight over fences between two homeowners. So I don't know what the answer is there, but somewhere to me, it seems we've got to address anything that's put on that property.
And Carla, a question for you, or Bill. When you say that fences, are their own thing, which I would agree, and I'm in favor of staff's recommendation, would we spell that out somewhere so that folks do understand that this does not apply to fences?
I suppose we could.
Or is it we're assuming it's understood?
Fences are one of like many rural jurisdictions, the county doesn't require a permit for a fence. So
right.
People don't even come in for a permit. When people call about it, we say a permit's not required. We request them to, look at the triangle of visibility if they have to be corner property and not block it. But we really don't have a way of, we're not actively regulating them like this.
Sure. Sure.
That helps.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Janet?
When we're looking at this, the setback seems to only be applying to accessory structures. It doesn't apply to what we talked about before. I guess in the accessory use, allowing it to be larger.
One is about the overall size, this is about where it's located.
Okay, so if it's a larger building, we're not going to require a further setback. Somebody can put a large building 10 feet from the property line?
Right, it's not, but right now they can put 3 or 5 feet.
Right.
They can put 3 or 5 feet? Okay. Right. It seems like that should be coordinated a little bit, that larger buildings should have larger setbacks. That would just be my suggestion. It would help not to shade if you put in a large building, you're going to be shading somebody's property, and it's going to be a lot more visible to somebody else's property, as opposed to a small shed would be less visible.
Thank you, Janet. Okay, so I think next we're going to talk about, and I don't know, Bill, if you're going to take us through this, the review of initial proposed draft task force recommendations, which was included at the end of your packet. So this is an attempt to summarize where we are or what we've done.
And I would like to emphasize the word attempt.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And hopefully folks have had some time to take a look at this. And I'm actually hoping that there are refinements and input from the task force, because I'm sort of putting words in your mouth to start out with, to start a conversation. And let's rather have them be your own words. So.
Yeah. I'm happy to give you some input.
Wonderful.
I did read it. And the one thing that I would suggest is that we try to make it more consistent. We're sometimes saying that our questionnaire, right? Sometimes we're offering comments on which way the questionnaire was, the majority or minority, right, in support of staff recommendation. I would suggest we do the same thing to our comments that are made. And I think we can't make assumptions about people that do not speak, but we can certainly, right? I can't assume if you don't say anything which side you're on. But if someone's voiced an opinion or submitted a letter, I think we could certainly say the majority was in support or the majority was not in support. And I think that would give further clarity to the commissioners and a more kind of just, overview of at least the voices in the room. So that was one thing that kind of jumped out at me. Pat?
Yeah, following up on what you're saying, I think when I read this, I thought it was mostly what the task force was thinking, or whether it was a task force consensus or not. And not so, I didn't see any references to public comments, but I think public comments, if we're trying to come to consensus when we talk about any one topic, and we listen to public comment, we read public comment, we meaning the task force, and then from their input should help direct what we're thinking as a task force. I'm not certain it's working that way, because sometimes we get, I think we make our comments and then Bill's making, and it's not a criticism, that is the way I'm viewing this. We, task force, make our comments, and Bill's basing the consensus on the comments of the task force. The added comments are coming from the public, and they're not being recorded here, whether that's right or wrong. We're not voting, which that's another story with me, but we're not supposedly voting on anything.
That's correct.
So the general population, that sounds like a prison. The sorry, when the public is making comments, they're not getting a vote, is the way I'm looking at it, because they're not part of the consensus thing. So,
but we did decide that we were not. Like a couple of weeks ago, we had a discussion about what we were trying to do here, right? Which was to have a discussion and to summarize the discussion, because we recognize like we are not reaching consensus on many things.
In many occasions we are not.
Right.
But my point is, I think, maybe I didn't make a point, but these recommendations are based on what the conversations are of the task force and not necessarily any input from public comments. Yet I think the task force should take into consideration what the public's saying when they come around to their consensus, right, thinking.
Right. And I would agree. I mean, I think that presenting comments as a whole, I mean, I don't know if you want to segregate public versus task force. I think we started off that way in the beginning, and then we kind of decided that we wanted to have, more voices heard. We were inviting the public to speak, and we didn't want their voices to just kind of like die in the ether. So
I have tried to only include the task force as in the task force consensus statement. So, and I do think the task force does listen to the public, and often there's discussion after the public's comments, and then the public actually returns the second set of comments. So there's certainly dialogue going on. So what I had purposely tried to be summarizing at least what I had heard the task force expressing, and trying to peg at least a general direction. That's helpful.
let me just,
let
Joe, and then Pat, and then Tom. Go, Joe.
Joe Hickman, quickly, thank you, Pat, about that. The other thing, and I think Chairman Cole mentioned it, is the Farm Bureau, the River Keepers, the Land Conservancy, and other groups we don't have a lot of people here. Sometimes we say we're just a small body, the task force and the public, and the staff probably says that no one cares. But I think, as you had stated, maybe at one of the last meeting, those groups, the Farm Bureau people are members thinking that group is championing my interest. The Shore Rivers are championing my interest. And I think we need to recognize that with the force that it has, because those members say, I don't have, I join organizations like that to support my interest. So I think we need to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Joe, that the River Keeper or the Farm Bureau, they're speaking for many and not the few.
And we've tried to make sure in the minutes that those organizations are represented, and at least from my point of view as staff, I think the things that those organizations have brought have been extremely helpful to the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Joe covered what I was going to say.
Okay, and then Tom?
Yeah, I think we have to realize that this task force has a job, and we're going to have a public meeting to where anyone can speak on anything. So I think the public comments now are basically a courtesy, and the whole community can speak when we have a public meeting, and they will have the opportunity to do whatever. And also the Ag Advisory Committee is going to review this. The Economic Development Committee should review this, and those comments should, I mean, they should carry a lot of weight. As far as some of the other groups, and speaking necessarily of Farm Bureau, I mean, it's very divided on some of this. I mean, there's a lot of the members of Farm Bureau that say necessarily don't agree with each other, and that's fine. I mean, that you always have that in a group. So, I mean, I think we've got to respect the task force. Everybody on the task force is serving as a volunteer, that put their time into it, and their decisions should be the ones that carry the most weight at this point.
Billy, did you want to make a comment? I saw you.
So I have a question with regard to P9. What's the new standards related to subdivisions versus private roads? That seems to be a pretty close vote on 5 and 4.
They're not votes. We're not voting.
Well,
It's words. It says votes here.
5, then yes. So just based using the wording here, I mean, whatever you want to call it, I still think that warrants a further discussion of the task force. Some of the other points where we were facing whether or not to bring the conversation to the floor based on that questionnaire, the margin was much higher for yeses or nos than in this particular one.
Well, but the 5 to 4 is the tallies for no, don't discuss it anymore, say no and don't discuss it anymore, and yes was don't discuss it anymore and say yes. So I understand that, but what brings it over to the questionnaire is if only 4 or fewer people wanted to discuss it further, it did get discussed. So there were 9 people who didn't want to discuss it further. 5 of them thought, yeah, no, we don't need to discuss it anymore and don't do it. And the other 4 thought, no, we don't need to discuss it anymore and do it. So, but still, there's 9 folks who didn't want to discuss it. That's what that represents. If that makes any sense. I understand what you're saying. It is unique that the folks who don't want to discuss anymore are pretty close to tied in which way they want to go with it. So, but that's what that means.
Yeah, I think we want to be clear that these aren't votes.
Right. I'm calling tallies.
I think tallies is a safer word, and I don't know. I guess I'm a little like, we did have a large discussion about what we were trying to do here. Once we realized, like several weeks in, that reaching consensus was not going to be possible in most cases. And so expressing an opinion of majority one way or the other seemed to be the best we could achieve in most cases. Pat?
Following up on that. So when you have these discussions and when you read the summary, the meeting summaries on any one particular topic, it'll say one member said, member number 2 said, member number 4 said, because we're given a number in the order if we're speaking. So when you get up to number 5 and then one rebuts and blah, 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 when you look at the total number that are actually having a conversation, of the 16 that are on this task force,
Yes.
7 are speaking, maybe 6 on a certain topic, sometimes only 4. So what happens to the other, if it's 4, the other 12 people haven't said anything. So what do we, So how do we know we drew a consensus? If they're silent, does that mean they're going along with the recommendation?
I think we acknowledge that we are not able to build a consensus. We do not have.
So, but I'm reading here, it's the consensus. That's the word on every one of these.
Well, I think we might want to change the wording so that we say of the task force members who spoke, because I don't think we can make assumptions about people.
We
that do not
can't.
speak.
That's just it. They're not saying anything.
And I think you could say of the task force that provided input, the majority was blah, 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 or not. I think that's probably the best we can do to be perfectly fair in the way we represent this.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's good. Thank you.
Questions or comments from anyone on the phone? Tyler, Brian, I know you're there. Cindy? Okay. Well, I am shocked that we actually.
Can I have one? I just have one comment.
Jamie, please. You might have to come forward. I'm sorry. You do? Oh. Sorry. All right. Let me go. If you're on the phone and you're trying to speak, please state your name and unmute.
Hi, yeah, this is Judy Gifford.
Hi, Judy. We hear you.
Hi. Good. I just want to say that tonight's meeting was really much improved on the phone. I could hear almost everybody. I couldn't hear Sam Shogi very well. So if he could fix his mic or move closer, I don't know how it's set up. But the rest of the meeting was really refreshingly clear and just so less annoying, I've got to say. So thank you very much for those changes.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Jamie from Economic and Tourism Development, and I'll be short. I just do want to address a few things that I've heard at the meetings. I've heard often during these meetings that the 2018 comprehensive plan states agriculture is viewed as a permanent and preferred land use. The rest of the text has been admitted thus far, so here's the full text. Agriculture is viewed as a permanent and preferred land use for the majority of the county. So that's on page 39, and I think that's really important. The second thing I want to address were some comments that were made last meeting, and I think it's kind of odd to hear folks opine on what economic has or has not done. No one at any of these meetings have spent any time in economic development or regularly attended Economic Development Commission meetings, with the exception of Cindy, who was on the commission, and Bill, who now attends, in the past 8 years that I've been doing economic development. So it was stated that economic development has not looked at Montgomery County's ag programs. So I want to share a little bit of information. Montgomery County has 1 million people, an economic development corporation with 20 staff members, and an office of agriculture within the county government with an additional 4 staff members. And they have a $6 billion budget. So it may not be the best comparison to compare Kent County or Kent County economic development with Montgomery County. So here's what we have done. In 2017, 2018, economic development advocated for the Upper Shore Regional Council to start the Farm Incentive, Sustaining Futures in Farming program administered through Marbidco. In FY18, $120,000 launched the program, and $20,000 was added in FY19. The program was supported by all 3 economic development offices and all 3 county commissioners. I'll leave flyers on the back table if anyone you know would be interested in learning more about the program, but it does exist. So just because words are spoken or repeated does not make them true.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So I would like to close out the kind of section on input on the task force recommendations, and then I think we'll save the remaining item for our next meeting since we're past, we do want to end on time. I'm trying very hard. Final comments or questions? Any input for staff on the task force recommendations as presented so far? Okay, Pat, you get the last word.
One quick question. These are the initial draft of the recommendations. They could change. Are they going to be looked at again or what?
I'll let Bill answer that.
The goal was to present them tonight for your all's review and input, and obviously we've gotten a good bit of input, so they will definitely be changing and come back to you. But the goal, at least my goal, is hopefully by the time we get to October 22nd and we have the public forum, that you're happy with your recommendations so the public can respond to them.
Okay. And then would we have a different set of recommendations that would be task force plus public that we're giving to the commissioners, or? And we can talk about that next week. Okay. I recommend we adjourn the meeting, close the meeting. Does anyone object? Nope. Okay. So thank you all very much.